Tribal spellcasters. Tribal spellcasters are found amongst the following races of creatures: bugbears, cavemen, ettins, giants, gnolls, goblins, hobgoblins, kobolds, lizardmen, ogres, orcs, troglodytes, and trolls. These spellcasters are divided into two types: shamans and witch doctors. Shamans are tribal clerics of 7th level or under. Shamans have only the following spells, and the reverse if applicable, which they are able to cast. First level, Cure Light Wounds, Detect Evil, Detect Magic, Light, Protection from Evil, Resist Fear. Second level, Augury, Chant, Detect Charm, Resist Fire, Snake Charm, Speak with Animals. Third level, Cure Blindness, Cure Disease, Dispel Magic, Locate Object, Prayer, Remove Curse. Fourth level, Divination, Exorcise, Neutralize Poison, and Tongues. Note that Wisdom does not affect the number of spells of tribal clerics, and the number of spells any such tribal cleric possesses is determined as if the shaman were a character of the appropriate level. There is a limit according to the race of the shaman as to how many levels of experience he or she can possess. Third level maximum, Ettin, Ogre, Troglodyte, Troll. Fifth level maximum, Bugbear, Gnoll, Kobold, Orc. Seventh level maximum, Giant, Hill, Stone, Fire, Frost only, Goblin, Hobgoblin, Lizardman. Witch doctors are tribal cleric magic users. In addition to the maximum level of clerical ability noted above, witch doctors of various races are able to use the following spells and the reverse if applicable. First level, affect normal fires, dancing lights, identify, push, shield, ventriloquism. Second level, audible glamour, detect invisibility, levitate, magic mouth, scare. The maximum level of magic user is dependent upon the race of the witch doctor. Second level maximum, bugbear, gnoll, kobold, lizardman. Fourth level maximum, caveman, goblin, hobgoblin, orc. And there's an asterisk. Cavemen tribes have normal clerical members. A tribe will have either shamans or witch doctors, but not both, except cavemen. That may be the worst sentence that I've read in the entire Dungeon Master's Guide so far. I'll say it again. A tribe will either have shamans, or witch doctors, but not both, except cavemen. Um, it is suggested that you include these figures into those tribes you personally determine, not random groups. All right. And I am Ben Riggs, author, historian, podcaster, member of the elite. With me, as always, is the Wizard of Wauwatosa, the weapon of mass instruction, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Yeah, good morning.
And we have just read from page 40 of the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, Tribal Spellcasters, which I assume was written by Gary Gygax. Again, the book was written by Gary, but other people had a hand here and there. This has the uh, Lake Geneva smell of Gary all over it. But Scott, you what did we plug at the beginning of the episode?
Well, the first thing is for those of you loyal listeners who would like a little bit more access to the thinking, thoughts, and conversations and discourse of the of the Reading D&D Aloud community, you should sign up for our Patreon, which is currently at $3 a month, which provides you access to our Discord channel and again an opportunity to continue to discuss all of these things that we read on the air. Yeah, as part of an informal conversation discourse, which is fantastic. So again, reading D&D aloud, and which will be posted in the show notes. But we're supported by and made possible through our Patreon members. So thank you very much.
All right, man. Happy Father's Day.
Yeah, happy Father's Day.
Tribal spellcasters.
Yeah, I
do
don't. Do we just move on to the section so we don't get ourselves in trouble? I think
I
it's the
mean,
only. I don't know what to do about this section. There's things I can say. There's things I don't know if I want to say. You start. You get us in trouble first.
I would start with I don't even have the background knowledge to go into the appropriateness or inappropriateness of various terms in there. Be it shaman, witch doctor, caveman. I mean, you know, I broadly, again, this is something we've said before, so I guess I'm actually going to kind of say it briefly, but like, uh, most of those demi-human races have some racist real world allegory, metaphor, analogy there. Again, it's I'll trace it back to Tolkien because Tolkien is what I'm more familiar with. Tolkien, the orcs, the goblins, the Southrons. He was imitating medieval epic, and in medieval epic, those forces were always the Muslims, the Saracens. Just straight up, and they are analogous there. Um, so that kind of prejudice just leaked, and I don't even know if leaked is the right word, was adopted by D&D kind of unthinkingly, and now it's being rethought.
Yeah, it definitely
Again,
it's coming from a place of, I mean, I think the same way that Tolkien does. It's definitely coming in a place where like this is one moment where you can get this concept of like a civil it's a civilized magic and an uncivilized magic, and it points to the tribal spellcasters, the witches, shamans. This is a crude, nasty magic that comes from. And when I was it's really interesting that you mentioned Tolkien because last night um somehow I ended up watching about 10 minutes on Netflix of the Two Towers extended edition. And it was the sequence where the orcs are taking, so I want to do the meme. The orcs are taking the hobbits to Isengard. They're taking the hobbits to Isengard. Sorry, that's a little bit of early 2000s memeness. And I was struck by the contrast between the orcs and the hobbits, and of course Aragorn and Gimli and what's the leafy guy's name? And Orlando Bloom. Like it's so similar to this. It's interesting how definitely Tolkien is kind of a part of that. Like the the bad guys are definitely shown as kind of cruel, crude, and you can't. It didn't make me feel uncomfortable as much as it made me kind of be like, wow, I'm surprised that Lord of the Rings, especially these movies, didn't get more for grief for, and I mean like the literal depiction of like I'm dancing around what I'm saying, which is the whiteness of like Viggo Mortensen and crew, and the dark skins of obviously the orcs. And I was like, wow, it's like it's so stark in those films, and I feel like you're getting a little bit of this. I think
did I
what
tell you the story of watching the Two Towers in Cairo at a movie theater?
no,
So, for those of you who don't know, I taught in Egypt for 2 years, and I was there when the Two Towers came out. And my buddy Omar, obviously Egyptian, and I go to see the Two Towers at a movie theater. And I'm sitting next to him, and he's like, "Man, this movie, it's so good. Like, I can't get over it. And it's so obvious that the Arabs are actually the heroes."
right.
By which he means the Fellowship of the Ring. He's like, I read this totally as an allegory wherein my people are the Fellowship of the Ring doing good. And he's like, and clearly America's the orcs in Mordor.
That's that's
And
brilliant, and I find that fascinating. I mean,
yeah,
I think in some ways that's why it's really there's a lot of things that we could say that I think are easy to say around because there's no way to get away with. I mean, as soon as you say tribal cultures or witches charms, you're venturing into problematic territory that somebody with a skin color of mine doesn't necessarily want to touch on because we're worried about getting in trouble. But I do think it's interesting that depending on the subjectivity, that there's more to just that surface level. I think it's interesting that somebody could see that, and you're almost always going to, I think, sympathize with kind of the main characters, and that's the way that they're made to be particularly sympathetic. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about the Lord of the Rings movies as well, is they go so out of their way. They add such an interesting flavor to the orcs and the goblins in the movies, especially rather than the books, which I feel like they're not much more than fodder to be cut down. Now I know there's 800 Tolkien scholars out there that are going nuts and going to tell me that I'm wrong. And well, you're more familiar with Tolkien than I am. Does he give
so
any?
I
Does
will
he?
say this: there's a really interesting scene, I believe, at the end of Two Towers, where Sam is listening to these two orcs talking. I believe after the capture of Frodo, and they're kind of like, we're not super fans of being slaves of the Dark Lord either. It kind of sucks. We should run away and become bandits.
But
So it is one of those interesting things where, like, Tolkien himself is like, well, now that I have an it's like his writer's instinct was like, well, I can't have them just be cackling caricatures of evil now that they're having a conversation. They
yeah.
have to be aware enough of their own victimization, but I also want to somehow paint them as essentially evil so they can kind of be untroublingly killed. Um, I've been doing an
Yeah.
off.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
it's like
sorry.
their alternative occupation can't possibly be like, what we should do is we should get together and form a band. It has to be, we should get together and just go, pillage and thief
Yeah, yeah.
is kind of our choice. But yeah, I was
We're gonna go independent evil.
yeah, right, yeah.
I don't
Well,
like this contract work.
there's no way we're going to be able to unionize, so we're going to have to go up and be independent contractors of evil. It's like that's the sort of thing. There's no way Sauron's going to let this go. I was going to say, I think I don't know how familiar folks are with the work of the writer Edward Said, who wrote a lot around the concept of othering, which is the concept that every kind of story is told from, well, it comes from a lot of the problematic nature of colonialism itself, but that there's a concept that there's a civilized world and there's an uncivilized world, and one of the ways that the civilized world can justify itself is by othering the uncivilized world, is by making them seem animalistic, by making them seem unsophisticated and often evil, right? That this is a thing you have to push back. Is it's the anti-complementary thing. It's a type of philosophy that's completely interpolated within and entangled with the social cultural systems of usually colonizers or folks that are in a position of power. And I'm sorry, there's no way to get through this without not thinking about that, without saying that in some ways Gary Gygax is othering some of the races of Dungeons and Dragons. But it does get back, and one of the questions that's also interesting about all of this thing is it okay to have, oh, I hate to use the term racist. Is it okay having monsters of these things that are, and this is something that modern contemporary Dungeons and Dragons is struggling with. Is it okay? What we could go back to the Caves of Chaos question, and I like again, even Gary Gygax wrestled with some of these complex issues. I apologize, I'm making many points and I'm digressing in so many different directions. But can you have monsters that are irredeemably evil? And then is it okay to butcher them? Because what you're doing is you're basically cleaning up. Because there's no way from getting away from the concept that does have that can make it certainly can make groups feel like really, really uncomfortable, right? Where's is can a does the game have to be a metaphor for something? Does it have to reveal things about ourselves? Does it have to necessarily make a rhetorical argument? I know a lot of folks, especially in the kind of the modern left, would definitely say yes. You cannot have a story where you go into the caves of chaos and massacre kobolds without literally watching yourself kind of you're painting yourself in the blood of the colonizers and of genocide, right? There's other folks that say no, it's a metaphor, it's a story, it's something like this, where actually it's an escape to a world where the morality is black and white. I don't have an answer to either of those two perspectives, but it's certainly, I think we can say it's definitely in this. In Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, there certainly is the concept of pure evil monsters with ancestries that they're irredeemable, right? There is no good goblin, which I find interesting. The Pathfinder, of course, has goblin as a playable race in 2024. What do you think?
I mean, number one, I think that our ethos in this podcast is going to be when we come across troubling stuff, we're going to talk. Um, we're also, however, reading the whole book aloud, basically, so it's not like we're sitting here being like, well, you have to throw it out. I mean, again, our attitude, I think I'm speaking for both of us when I say, yeah, there's some racist stuff in Shakespeare. You don't throw out Shakespeare. You're just like, and then this part, Shakespeare was being racist. Um, that is our take on things, I would say. I am
Absolutely. Well,
looking.
yeah, you can never get across the point that in 100 years, everything that we're saying now is going to be seen as irredeemably, ignorant. So I think you have to put it all, and because I believe in time as an illusion, I think that in many ways, when you do look back on these things and see the problematic nature, I think in some ways you're actually changing them because we're viewing it through a new interpretive lens that is completely different. I books may be somewhat of a static artifact, but the way we think about them and dream about them is never static, right? So I don't think the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Master's Guide in 2024 is the same as it was in 1977. And I think that that's,
I'm looking right now on rascal.news, which is Lynn Codega's uh new website. since leaving IO9, and because I saw an article by a Native American game designer on almost essentially here I just found it. Hack the orcs, loot the tomb, and take the land. Reflections on settler
Right.
colonialism,
Yeah.
indigeneity, and otherwise possibilities in Dungeons and Dragons by Daniel Heath Justice, which I read and I thought was really, really interesting and really directly addresses what we're talking about here because the writer Daniel um, they as I recall from the article grew up on a reservation, found Dungeons and Dragons, liked it, but then was pretty quickly like, oh, I see where I fit in this game, and you know, it was very discouraging. And
Well,
again, to people who would push back on this and be like, it's just like Jim Ward would be pushing back on us right now, the late Jim Ward who was a close friend of Gary Gygax, would be like, "This is just fun. It's just like it's not a big deal. It's just a game. You're just killing these orcs. It's like stormtroopers." Um, and you know, I feel like Daniel Heath Justice directly pushes back on that narrative by saying, "Yeah, but when I see myself as that evil, that it's okay to kill, that is personally deeply troubling and also is a real barrier to getting people into the game. And I think that we would all agree tabletop role-playing games are wonderful and we would like the hobby to expand. And if people look into the hobby and they're like, I see that I am the killable other in this. Uh, you know, if all the orcs had Polish last names, again, my last name is Riggs. That's my dad's name. My mother's name is last maiden name was Kowalkowski, or you know, everyone has an Irish last name and you're like, wait a second. Everybody has an Irish last name.
yeah.
Really? Like, and again, like, and there, like, Morgul is pretty close to Mogul and Mongol, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't think you can play, I think it's what's the way? It's ingenuous to play this game and not recognize some of the kind of, base foundational concepts around, but again, like I feel like it does come from this concept like civilization being good. It comes from the Edward Said type of things of like the othering of civilizations. I also think it's interesting that you so what was the person that you just mentioned that
Daniel
just
Heath Justice.
Daniel Heath Justice,
And
something I
again, it
need to
is a
read.
long piece. It's a 24-minute read, but I'm gonna click through it right now. Seeing there was one passage I wanted to see if I could find, but you go ahead and keep talking for a
Yeah,
second.
well, there's two things I thought it was interesting because you kind of mentioned the Tolkien, you mentioned watching Lord of the Rings in Cairo and how doesn't, kind of looking past like the surface features of the Peter Jackson thematic representation, and yet your friend was still identifying with the Fellowship of the Ring. But here in this case, it's hard, well, I don't know. Are the heroes in Tolkien more sympathetic or less evil than the heroes that we necessarily play in a game of Dungeons and Dragons? But the other, darn it, there was something else I wanted to say that was even more important than that. Oh, I
Okay,
know.
let
I want to quickly talk about sports because I always want to bring it back to sports. But this reminds me of a conversation that I have. As everybody knows, I'm kind of a big sports fan, particularly baseball and hockey, two sports I follow rather closely. And often when I talk to and those in the tabletop role playing community, I'm sure if you do follow sports, I know that you probably have a lot of friends that don't. Often use the term sports ball, which is it's offensive to those. It's not offensive. I'm just kidding. But the folks that kind of look down on those of us who follow sports, and I often have this conversation with other tabletop role playing gamers who are or non-sports fans who talk about like the concept of tribalism within sports games. And I feel like, oh, tribalism, and by the way, pun was not intended, but I'll take it. But the concept is, especially, I'm not an American football fan, though I used to be. And I remember, I would often go when I did follow American football, and I was a big Oakland Raiders fan, would often you could go to a bar and it was fascinating to watch all of the different folks for the different teams who'd wear their jerseys. You have Detroit Lions fans, you could have Green Bay Packers fans, Pittsburgh Steelers fans. And I actually kind of loved part of that because it was so symbolic of like where people were coming from. I was living in San Francisco at the time, which is one of the most transient cities in the world. And in some ways that's great. In some ways, yeah, modern day San Francisco is reflective of some of the problems of that, but I digress. but I thought it was wonderful that people could kind of represent their hometowns. At the same time, it's, when if the Raiders are playing the Steelers and one team is winning and losing, the people are really, really getting into it. Certainly, there's numbers of, violent interactions between sports fans of other teams, which demonstrate the lengths and the passion that people take their sports teams. That it is, and I mean this I don't mean this in the problematic sense of the term, but the sense of the term that you have your own clan, very tribalistic, right? And it's not always necessarily a positive thing because you can believe that you are definitely better. I mean, I would definitely say that a Raiders fan is better than a Broncos fan every single time. But I digress again. But my friends would often be like that would be one of the things that turned them off about sports was that kind of tribalism, that permission to kind of believe yourself better than another thing. My answer had always been, well, this is a vicarious release, right? Because we actually do. I mean, one of the things that I talk over and over again to folks that I always think that we have too high of an idea about our biological mechanisms and our intellectual capacity. If there's one thing I think that I shouldn't say holds us back, because I'm not trying to make a defensive AI or Skynet, but we really are bound by the biological limitations of millions of thousands of years of evolution. And one of those things is that we do fear the other. Right. And I think being aware of that as possible to find out how ridiculous it is really, really important. But one of my arguments for sports is that it allows you to, I always said that it always allows you to vicariously experience that concept of like, here's my group, there's my group. We don't have to like them. We can shout at them. And it does it in a way that doesn't have any real world ramifications, right? It goes back to the concept of play being the magic circle that you enter, and anything that happens in your little magic circle of play doesn't impact the world doesn't impact it. You get a chance to escape. There's Kay Le Guin used to say, fantasy literature is an escape towards freedom. For a momentary thing, you get to vicariously, you get to have your tribal geez, I don't use the term tribal anymore, especially after talking about the concept of somebody discovering Indian reservations is even more problematic. But the concept of your own group being better than other groups, and it's in a place that you could do it harmlessly. Now, again, the reason that the magic play metaphor never works is because everything that you do in you've mentioned it all the time. A tabletop role-playing games gets you explore your identity. So no, I'm not saying that you can go cheer for your Oakland Raiders and dress up in their Oakland Raiders don't exist anymore, but they should. Dress up in your paint and your enormous pads and yell at Broncos fans, and that doesn't get to bleed over into somewhat of your identity. But I do think it gives you, I don't know. I think it gives you an outlet, if so to speak. It gives you some way where you can exercise some of those demons that are bound up in our biological systems, and so that it doesn't come. So then you can take off the spiky pads and then return to your life as an accountant, and hopefully not necessarily believe that you have these little groups that are better than others.
Well, having grown up Catholic, I would tell you that most experiments with oppressing human nature don't seem to work. So
That's a truism, right? Like I think
whatever I think about people dressing up, like to be like, well, they shouldn't do that because it leans into bad human habits from early in civilization. I think people are going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I, I'm always amazed at the contemporary concept that like a lot of our worst natures are something that we just need to think ourselves through. Like, dude, our brains are they're not that great. Like they do some amazing things, but they're made to survive. They're not necessarily made to be living in the most, in many ways, most humane culture possible. I think it's a testament to some of the things that we've done that we have been able to modify the way that we think, the way that we see the world in more humane natures, but there's still, as Stephen King used to say, in the back of our minds, there's still those crocodiles that lurk. And funny I bring up Stephen King because he, like me, actually has that same concept that you need some vicarious outlet. One of Stephen King's best books ever, it's a nonfiction book called Dance Macabre. He says that the reason people need horror fiction is because you have to feed the crocodiles. You have to read these moments of like terrible horror and live through these things, because if you don't feed the crocodiles, then they come out in your regular life. Now, my non-sports friends never buy this concept. They're like, no, you guys are just You're literally exercising your greater team. But the metaphor for Dungeons and Dragons is, can you play Dungeons and Dragons and do something in this game that represents, if you can you murder hobo in this game and not have it impact who you are? Or does it allow it? Or is it that we have an instinctual evolutionary need to murder hobo in some way? And this allows us to do it. And I shouldn't say murder hobo, but like to exercise our violent instincts, or maybe to exercise a violent agency to mangle and massacre the world in ways that we think it should be. And then again, return to our lives as accountants or teachers or what have you. What do you think, Ben? Is Dungeons and Dragons? Can we play evil without becoming evil? Can we
I
look
would
at the
like
abyss
to
without it looking at us?
I'd like to read an excerpt from Hack the Orcs, Loot the Tomb by Daniel Heath Justice here on rascal.news. Because it seems to speak directly to what we're talking about from someone who is, a Indigenous person who plays D&D, which seems like the most relevant voice here. Quoting directly, of course, humans and demi-humans weren't the only beings in D&D. These worlds were full of monsters too, the quote, savage peoples,
Right.
goblins, orcs,
Yeah.
ogres, and all their kin who regularly burst forth from their strongholds to pillage and slaughter villages and towns unfortunate enough to be in their path, end quote. And the author then goes on to describe how bad they are in the game. Thus, their subjugation was not only an act of self-preservation, but the highest possible good to defend civil society, history, family, and social order. And this is where the savagism versus civilization binary really came in. For the function of monsters was, like that of all savages in this ideological structure, to die, and thereby give certainty of purpose to the civilized. One side of this binary is culturally complex, sophisticated, literate, ambitious, and the other is brutish, superstitious, and little more than mindless beasts. Civilization depends on its opposite. And then I'm going to skip a little bit here. Um, and the association of both the demi-humans and the monsters with indigenous and colonized people was hardly coincidental. Indeed, it was baked into the earliest iterations of the game. As Eugene Marshall notes, it's hard to ignore the fact that when he first created miniatures for the fantasy races, Gary Gygax chose Turk minis to depict orcs and repainted Native American figures for trolls and ogres. End quote. Indigenous peoples were rendered monstrous and therefore killable, neither one worthy of mourning or compassion. The savage dies so that the civilized may flourish no matter how bloody the cost. And then he goes on to talk about how he always played demi-humans in the game.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I
I,
think that puts it really nicely for me.
I,
And I would say that I think that if you play an evil character, I don't think it's like, if you write American Psycho, and you write this really awful character, I don't think it makes Bret Easton Ellis a psycho.
yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, again, that's what is the there's so many directions. As soon as you mentioned American Psycho, my gosh, so many different directions we can go on that one too, and I don't want to because
Well, we could just start reading spell descriptions. That's the next thing.
well, I wanted to there was something that you just said there. Darn it,
Or
that I
I have
really
something to
want.
say about Tolkien that's a little unrelated, but
You were
related
saying,
to previous themes. But go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. This I think is really important. Because you mentioned that when he's playing, he's always choosing demi-humans. He's kind of in many ways kind of pushing back around the foundation, as and the scaffolding or like I said, the interpretable nature of some racist assumptions, I should say. This brings up the concept of Michel de Certeau's difference between strategy and tactics, which is that often we live our lives within systems that people create to control or at least direct the actions that we do, right? The way that a city is designed is make people go in a certain area. The way media is often designed, the way the media, I would say, like even the modern platform capitalisms are made for us to. I hate the word consume capitalism, but the way for us to interact with our modern day, I gotta say, consume media, to interact with our modern media. But then there's the concept of tactics, which is that the person on the street, like you might live in a city that says you have to go here, you're not allowed to. It's funny, the State University of New York at Buffalo. This is always a great example. That was where I got my undergraduate degree in filmmaking. Go Bulls. And the the modern part, there's two campuses on the State University of New York at Buffalo. There's a northern campus and a southern campus. And the southern campus is old, the northern campus is modern. And when I say modern, it's created in the 1970s, which is hilarious. I suppose nobody would call that modern anymore. It was created in the 70s, early 80s. And when they designed the new campus, they went out of their way because they were so worried about all of the political upheavals of the 1960s and what had gone on and the student uprisings and stuff like that. They purposely designed the northern campus so that people wouldn't have a place to congregate more than 10 to 20 people at a time. That's strategy, this concept that we are going to be able to control the number of students that will meet at a certain place. And the tactics are the way that people on the ground level, the people that are actually walking through those hallways or walking through the avenues, actually resist those types of things, and saying, this is what somebody wants me to do with this. This is the way that I'm actually going to use it. I'm going to use an example from Michel de Certeau. And I don't have, by the way, I have no idea of how students actually resisted that with Student University of New York at Buffalo, except from what I understand, it probably was a little effective. That SUNY Buffalo didn't have a student union until I was there in the 1990s. But it's interesting to me because in my dissertation, I talk about Dungeons and Dragons itself as being an example of tactics to resist the strategy, because Dungeons and Dragons is a way for us to interact with literature or literary conceits or storytelling in a way that resists the traditional concept of, like, I will tell you a story and you will listen to it and you will nod like a good little subject. And that is all you can do with your story. And you can take it and you can have it, whatever parable or moral you can get from it, that's yours. But you can't do anything with literature. You're not allowed to actually be Conan. You're not allowed to actually decide what Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are going to do next. But Gary Gygax had tactics against that. He resisted the concept of a top-down literary strategy. He said, no, I want to play with these things. And not only am I going to play with these things, I'm going to give other folks the opportunity to play with, and to not only play with, these classical worlds from literature, but also the worlds that I create. I'm going to allow you how to tactically influence, change, and exert, your own agency on these types of worlds. But going back to, I feel like
No,
I'm being rather wordy today.
I gotta say something there.
Well,
Is
I
that
just want
okay?
to say this
Say it.
gentleman is doing that, right? He is taking Gary Gygax's strategies. Like, this is how you're going to have to be. You've got these tribal spellcasters. You've got this othering of there's bad monsters and good heroes. And he's saying, I'm going to resist and complicate that notion to make it suit my purpose, not yours. And I think in some ways, tabletop role-playing games, capacity to do that makes them in some ways really, really cool. Please.
So, a thing I've been talking about on this podcast fairly regularly is how well my One Ring campaign is going.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. Okay, finally.
and how it does feel like Tolkien when we sit down. Um, and I've been like, that's really weird. Like, it's great, but how is this happening? What is the mechanism bringing about this emotional state? And I've had a small revelation. So I'm also working on a horror novel, and I'm finishing it up. And I've finished up novels before, uh, but I'm deep in Act 3. Stuff is happening, fur is flying, people are dying. It's great. Um, I've resurrected the dead, and the feeling of that as a writer is remarkably similar to the wow, this campaign is going really good feeling that you get when like a campaign is just like clicking, and things are going well, and the fact that the feeling of novel is going well is so similar to campaign is going well, I found to be both fascinating and illuminating, because it's kind of like from the trenches evidence of what you're talking about here, where D&D really is a democratization of the tools of storytelling so that everyone can do it. Because again, writing a novel is hard. I would also say I would recommend to everyone in the world, go write a novel. Don't even worry about getting it published. You write the novel for the experience of writing a novel, because it is a joyous thing. It's difficult, but it is a joyous thing. Um, but it's hard, right? D&D is way easier than writing a novel for all the difficulties of various editions of D&D. So it takes that joy and spreads it to others. It's really again, I'm 45 going on 46 in August. You would think that there's nothing else I can learn about D&D and tabletop role-playing games by playing them, but I'm still learning stuff at this great age. So hopefully that was a suitable segue. I found it very illuminating when it happened the other day. Um, Want to say something else? Should I read some spell descriptions? What do you want to do?
No, I think it's, we could end on the concept of like, well, I think it's interesting you talk about tabletop role-playing games. Or like, but I love that you bring up the concept of your One Ring game. Like, this is a explicit rendition of you. If there is any fantasy author where we have to think of them as canon, I mean, think about the people that get their swords knotted in their scabbard about like any changes to anything about Tolkien, right? The current Rings of Power series on Amazon, right? In many ways, like, is there a more canonical fiction that you can't touch than Tolkien himself? And yet here you are playing a game with your friends around the table where, right, like One Ring allows you to completely change. Like, if I'm not mistaken, because I think you've mentioned this on the cast a few times, if you'd like in this game, Sauron and Saruman can win. Is that not correct?
I mean, again, there's nothing stopping you. Like if you're a member of my One Ring campaign, maybe you want to turn this off right now. I had I had a young Aragorn show up and say that he wanted to be the squire of one of my characters because they were a ranger. They just had a great success, and I'm like, okay, Aragorn shows up. He wants to be your squire. And the character was like, get him out of here. I do not want Aragorn running around here because, again, he's a longtime player. And I think he knew that I would be like, oh, it'd be great if Aragorn died. Like, that would be the best thing that could happen. Suddenly, we are playing a Lord of the Rings game without a net, and anything can happen. And, well, how, are you guys gonna have to take care of this ring problem? Because, like, Aragorn's dead now. He's dead. Are you going to be the next Aragorn? Like, you're just going to be a little bit older. Um, so again, I really delight in when I'm playing in a pre-existing universe in changing it in a fundamental way that forces the characters to the center of the action.
Yep.
I think this player though hates that. This player is there for a simulationist experience, and God save Aragorn. Get him out of here. Don't let Ben near him. He's gonna mess it all up.
I feel it's like your players are going back in time and have run into their parents and are like, no, we've got to make sure that they still meet, or like that those things. By the way, I completely applaud and if you run your game like, but I can't tell you, I'm completely on the same page as you. If I was you, I would be like, no, this is our alternate multiversal rendition of how the Lord of the Rings is going to go. I would have had a piano fall on Aragorn and be like, all right, you guys are gonna have to pick up the pieces now if you want this world to not descend into
I
the Shire being
was
enslaved.
I was interviewing Rodney Thompson this week. He designed Lords of Waterdeep and he worked on fifth edition. He left Wizards. I think he said within 6 months of fifth edition launching. Um, and he was a huge West End game Star Wars guy. Absolutely loved it. And he just casually threw out in the conversation that the best uh, campaign he ever ran was a prequels campaign where he was like, okay, it's the events of the prequels. We're starting at the beginning, but nothing canonical will happen. This is the other story of Anakin Skywalker and his conversion to Darth Vader. That's the story that we are telling. Um, and I was like, that's fascinating. What a good idea. Like,
Yeah.
what if you had a campaign where it was like, okay, who wants to be Anakin? Like, one of you is going to be Anakin Skywalker. Who wants to be Anakin? And off we go. And I'm like, I'm like, maybe I should run that campaign. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Well, I mean, it's fine. I mean, well, how many of us want to like, in some ways, like, I don't want to use the term fix, but like take the mistakes that we see or the things that make us, whether they're mistakes based on, problematic assumptions about people in the world, or whether we just don't like how a story goes. Like, that's the tactics of like tabletop role play games. They allow us, I don't want to use the term fix, but they allow us to impose our own agency on what should have happened. By the way, I have to mention the Star Wars prequels. I always say this when people ask me what I think about the prequels, because I think this is similar to that, which is I always say, like, I think that if there's any prequel fans out there, I apologize, but I'm obviously not a huge fan of the prequels. And I always say that, like, to me, the prequels are basically like bad dinner theater representations of what actually happened. Like, there's no way it looked that ridiculous if people actually said lines that were that ridiculous. Like, this is
I hate
some
sand.
small community. It's coarse and it's rough and it gets in everything. Um, but yeah, like I can't. It's funny because it's funny. I just mentioned like Tolkien fans get their scabbards in a twist when People mess with that when the prequels came up. Like the same things happened to me. I'm like, you're kidding me. Like in my own imagination, it was way cooler than this. Like it didn't oh my gosh, let's not get into the prequels. But I always it's like that's not canon. I have there's only four films that are canon. You can guess which four. And the rest are like these strange things. But
I mean,
tabletop
the
role-playing games,
three are obvious. What's the fourth one? Is my question.
I bet everybody could guess. It's the only new movie that's actually pretty darn good and it holds up after repeated viewings, which of course is Rogue One. But Gareth Edwards,
Oh
nice
wow,
again.
you like Rogue One?
Doesn't everybody? I
No,
feel
I
like I'm
saw it
not
once.
alone.
I saw it once and haven't bothered seeing it again. But Andor
I
makes
am
me
shocked. I am shocked and appalled that there's gambling in this casino.
Andor makes me want to go back and watch it again though. So maybe I'll find something in it I didn't see the first time.
Rogue
Uh,
One's fantastic. I mean, the strange dark, the strange. It's the movie, and I can't even. She's like my kids have seen a lot of. Well, the kids have seen the first three Star Wars movies. They don't need to see the others. But I can't. It's like I love Rogue One, but I can't show them that one because it has such a spoiler. It doesn't end well.
well, and the I am one with the Force. The Force is with me. I mean, that's amazing.
Mm.
There's certainly flashes of brilliance in Rogue One.
Hmm.
And God, the trailer, like I watched that trailer until my eyes practically bled. It was so good, but
Now you
I
need,
was disappointed by the movie.
give it
Um,
another. I hope everyone in the Discord channel is now gonna back me up on this because like Rogue One definitely deserves a couple of subsequent
oh
viewings.
yeah,
It's
I'll
really
give it a
good.
second. I'll give it a second watch. Maybe I'm wrong. I feel like I had something else to say here about Star Wars gaming, but now I cannot recall what it was.
Well, I'm going to end with a conclusion. I think one of the things that's fascinating about all these things is tabletop role-playing games, and I don't like the concept that they're like a unique medium. But I will say one of the things that's really fantastic about them is that they encourage rather than discourage agency within the way that they're played and the way that they're interpreted, right? I think that's fun. It doesn't come from a top-down concept. It doesn't come from the concept that there's a canon that you cannot mess with. If you think about the fact that the Forgotten Realms, penned by Ed Greenwood or Greyhawk, created by Gary Gygax, are all created for you to change, is cool, right? You're not allowed to change Middle Earth when you read Tolkien. You can't say, hey, Tom
That's what it
Bombadil should get
was.
the ring.
That's what it was. It's because when TSR was trying to get the rights to Middle Earth, they were the Tolkien estate was fine with the role-playing game products,
Hmm.
but was deeply disturbed by the idea of a fiction line set in Middle Earth, which is
Right,
one of the things
right.
TSR wanted to do.
Yep.
And Christopher Tolkien vociferously apparently was like, no. Um, and yet, and I've not interviewed the people involved in this, but this is a thing I have to do. About 10 years later, Wizards of the Coast was working on a Harry Potter role-playing game. They got pretty far along into the Harry Potter role-playing game when it actually came to the attention of Joanne Rowling that her people were talking to wizards and that there was a role-playing game in development, and her reaction to this was, wait, they're going to tell new stories set in my world with my characters that I have no control over. And her people apparently were like, yes, that is what's going to happen. And they're going to give you money for it. Like the company, Wizards of the Coast, will pay you money to create this game. And she's like, I don't want their money. And no one's going to tell stories in my world with my characters except for me, was apparently her reaction and shut it down. Now, again, I haven't fact checked that. I've interviewed no one involved, but that's the story as I have heard it from people at Wizards, not the ones involved necessarily. But um, that is so anti what we're talking about here, right? Like,
I'm so struck by I'm sorry, and I know, well, first of all, I think that that's fascinating, and I think like who owns fiction, right? I mean, technically, can't we just say that every Dungeons and Dragons game is a form of fan fiction, like it literally is? We're all taking a world that's been created, well, or often we're creating our own. I shouldn't say that. There's a lot of folks out there that are making their own campaign sandbox. My campaign world is my own world, except what I do is it's the most pilfered world of all. I don't know folks who've ever played in my games. I have something called the World of Apshai, and it's literally like divided into different ages, so you can play different systems in different ages and different epics. But then I pull things from everything I like. But I'm getting off topic. But the concept of like who owns the basic, doesn't it? I think it kind of always belongs to the reader. But my thing that I was not viscerally reacting to, but I was thinking about J.K. Rowling again, speaking of problematic things that I don't want to touch. Um, the difference between, if that's true, if that story is completely true about J.K. Rowling's, ownership around the world of what do we call her world? What do we call it? The wizarding world, I suppose.
The
Um,
Wizarding World is what has been adopted.
but the difference between her and Ed Greenwood, who is like, I got to see Ed Greenwood speak recently at Legends and Founders, and boy, did I walk away with a lot of thoughts on that. But I mean, how much you know this, and this is why this podcast is so good because you have this amazing knowledge. But like, how much was it that he sold Forgotten Realms? And he's literally like, they're like, hey, we want to take your world, let people play in it all the time. This thing that you've created since you were like 13, 12 years old, and been writing stories. And he's like, sure. And they don't even give him very much money to do it.
Five
What was the
grand.
5 grand, right? You're like, he's like, all right. I mean, that speaks to
And I
who
think it
those two
was in
people are.
19 I think it was in $1986, so a bit more, but still, like considering you now have one, and God, I hope we get a second, but I don't think we're going to, uh major Hollywood movie set in the world of the Forgotten Realms, and he got like only 5 grand. I
Mhm.
will tell you that my understanding through back channels is that when a Marvel creator has a major Hollywood production based on one of their creations, their tip is also 5 grand. Again, I feel like in many ways, a theme of this podcast that we keep returning to is
Mhm.
the tension between creatives and creation and uh, corporations and profit and exploitation and making money. Because again, on the one hand, again, I do want my Edgin the Bard socks. I do want these corporations to successfully produce a creation that I want to see. But at the same time, they really do struggle with it for various and sundry reasons. And I remembered another thing I was going to say earlier. I'm reading a book called Wonder Book by Jeff Vandermeer, which is, I think, the best book on the craft of writing that I've read in a long time. Um, and in it, one of the things that he says can spark a fictional work is working in reaction to something. Like you see something and you're like, I don't like that. I kind of want to fix it in some way, shape, or form. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do it myself and change it. Man, the prequels just, they didn't work for me. I'm gonna go run a Star Wars campaign to
Yeah.
fix the prequels. And eventually, if the consensus of uh people over time is that the prequels don't work, once it gets into the public domain, someone's going to be like, all right, I'm going to go fix the prequels. I'm going to go just make my own Star Wars movies once it's in the public domain, which will happen eventually, and fix it that way. All right. Anything else?
We've gone in every
We've
direction they can possibly go.
yeah, I think we rolled a critical success on our digression roll.
We we need to get those dice made. We need to get dice that somehow roll in different directions. Like there's like little jumping beams inside the dice. All right. Yeah, we can move on.
All right. Then I will say again, we are I should shout out my convention schedule for the coming year. Uh, I'm gonna be appearing at QWERTY Fest in Milwaukee next week, which I think is regrettably too late for the people listening to this podcast to hear about it. So sorry about that.
Time is an
Um,
illusion. They can come. They just have
they
to
can,
travel
yeah,
back in time.
it'll happen. I am doing a ton of stuff at Gen Con. I'm doing a few new history seminars. I'm in the Gen Con Writers Symposium. Scott and I think, are both appearing at Gamehole Con.
Yeah, we're doing this live. We're doing a reading D&D aloud at Gamehole Con, I believe Friday night at some point.
Yep.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to be a guest of honor at WindyCon in Chicago in early November. Um, and I am a guest of honor at the Philadelphia Area Gaming Exposition in January of 2025. So if you are near or about any of those places and you would like to come see me in the flesh, please feel free to do so. I'll try and repeat that schedule like once a month for the next few months or something. Because again, I feel like I'm terrible about that and I should be better about it considering I have a podcast. I will again say, if you have not yet purchased my book, Slaying the Dragon: A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, please do so. Summer is here, which means I will be much better at being on Discord, and I have consented that Discord will be my primary method of communication on the podcast now. Therefore, I'll be on it at least daily, I would assume. So that should improve things. Um, so if you want to have this conversation continue, and again, sometimes I'll post like weird things that I don't want to put on social media there. Please, for $3 a month, you keep the podcast going and you get to enjoy the Discord. Oh, and if anyone has any bright ideas about things they would be willing to pay us money for at higher tiers in our Patreon, please let us know on the Discord. It's a thing we were talking about the other night, and I thought to myself this morning, we should ask the listeners. Maybe they're like, hey, if Scott will cook me an omelet and send it to me in the mail, I'll give you guys a $50 a month. Oh, for shipping an omelet, $50, that's not bad. It would be a very curious request, but stranger things have happened. And Dr. Scott, you want to shout out your diss?
Yeah, do I? Yeah, well, everyone's always, more than welcome to take a look at my dissertation. Again, the concept of talking about folks in the Discord is always fun. So I do like to talk to meet with folks there. I'm looking forward to, I do hope that we will have an opportunity to talk to fans of the podcast at gamehole.com, since we're both going to be there, which is always really fun. And I'm always happy to reach out and touch, or, to talk to people at cons about those things. And maybe I should go to Gen Con too. Although, as folks know, I'm terrified of large groups of people. And evidently, there seems to be a large group of people at Gen Con.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, then, I'm going to say, Scott, happy Father's Day. You have a good day.
Have a fantastic one.
We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.